All right, welcome to the last set of slides from the Mendelian genetics lecture. So let's get where we left off. Woo! We had just finished talking about pedigrees. So, I have that backwards. That ought to help. So we had a mom who was recessive, and you had a dad who was dominant. Say we didn't actually know what his other allele was. We only knew that he was a dominant allele carrier. So you have the brother, and you have me, and we have the dominant trait. Nothing out of the ordinary. Whenever you have a dominant with a recessive, you tend to get the dominant trait. But then you have the sister here with the recessive trait. So in order to have the recessive phenotype, she has to be homozygous recessive, just like mom. But since she gets one allele from mom and one allele from dad, it can't be a dominant allele, so it has to be a recessive allele. And that way we know that dad is heterozygous. And because my brother and I are dominant, that means we have the dominant phenotype. We got the dominant allele from dad, so we had to get the recessive allele from mom. So just basic information has allowed us to reason out every single genotype, but we did this in class. So now let's talk about recessive genetic disorders. So Mendelian genetics and what happens when we have disorders. Sickle cell anemia is a type of recessive disorder, in which case the proteins making up the hemoglobin don't bind together properly, and it results in a red blood cell that's sort of crumpled. It has this characteristic sickle cell shape you can see right here. It carries less oxygen, doesn't carry as much oxygen. It's actually sharp, which means it can damage organs or vessels that constrict it, right? So your capillaries, the thinnest blood cells in your body, are actually thinner than a full-size red blood cell. So red blood cells like squeeze through your capillaries. And so a sickle cell in there can actually damage your capillaries. It can lead to people losing limbs if they get too much capillary damage in their extremities, like they'll lose toes and stuff. So sickle cell anemia, characterized by its malformed hemoglobin that results in sickle red blood cells. So they carry less O2. One of the organs that will often take damage is the spleen, and it produces anemia. Anemia is where you're literally not getting enough oxygen for regular activity. So you're going to be exhausted. You're going to be very low energy, headaches, and whatnot. So if you have sickle cell anemia, you're going to be anemic. So pretty crappy disorder. Anyway, dominant genetic disorders. There are no carriers for a dominant genetic disorder. Remember, we talked about carriers right here. Dad and child 1 and 2 were carriers because they carry the recessive allele, but they do not express the recessive allele. So you're a carrier. If you are heterozygous for the sickle cell anemia, you are a carrier. So if you're heterozygous, you're a carrier. So why are there no dominant genetic disorder carriers? Oh yeah, that's right. Literally because if you have one allele for the disorder, you have the disorder. You can't be a carrier. A carrier doesn't express the disorder. So some dominant allele or dominant genetic disorders include osteogenesis imperfecta. This one's a neat one, right? If you've ever seen the movie Unbreakable, the kids, they called me Mr. Glass. Basically, osteogenesis imperfecta is where you get collagen malformation. Right, so there's two things that make up your bones. There's the calcium crystals, right, which is why we talk about bones, you know, needing calcium and whatnot. So you have all these little calcium crystals, and then you have these protein fibers running through them, collagen. So the calcium crystals give a rigidity to the bone, but they are very fragile on their own. So if you have collagen that's all screwed up, your bones are going to be brittle and they'll break easily. So you have defective collagen. This is actually treatable, which is pretty cool. That joke doesn't necessarily make sense in this case, so we'll just cross it out. It was another attempt to reference Unbreakable, but Bruce Willis didn't treat the disorder, so lame. Anyway, it is treatable. You just need injections of collagen. Your body will be able to, if you put enough collagen in there, it will be able to organize the collagen where it's supposed to go. So that's pretty cool. And a Unbreakable reference means I'm very old, along with my Matrix references and my Star Wars references. I realize now that some of you were less than 1 year old when the new Star Wars prequel movies that suck came out. That's enough of that. Achondroplasia dwarfism is actually a really cool, really cool disorder. So disorder doesn't mean bad. It just means developing in a way that's, counter to the genes. I don't know what I'm saying. Anyway, achondroplasia dwarfism is a cool disorder. In it, you have short stature. You have, this is going to be an awful drawing, but you have a head that is relatively normal sized, and then you'll have a body that's disproportionately short. Body and legs are disproportionately short to the head. Let's just pretend I didn't do that. So your arms and legs are disproportionate. You're 4'10" or shorter. And here's, man, I always forget this dude's name. Pete, good old Petey. We'll go with Pete, who plays, oh man, now I've forgotten the Game of Thrones character that has achondroplasia dwarfism. Yeah, geez. I am killing it today. So, here he is with his achondroplasia dwarfism. And this is going to be really cool. Let's make a pedigree. Because you can see, here's his wife, and here's his daughter. Right? So we know he has achondroplasia dwarfism. So here we go. Bop, bop. We know his wife does not have achondroplasia dwarfism. So she's homozygous recessive for the gene that causes achondroplasia dwarfism. And we see they have a child. And the child, the daughter, does not have achondroplasia dwarfism. This picture caught her making a weird, funny face. And that's why he's making a weird, funny face. Anyway, she does not have achondroplasia dwarfism. So, just looking at this, we now know that, boom, he's heterozygous. You know, the genotype of a celebrity. How cool is that? All right, let's get into, now that we've taught you all sorts of important stuff about Mendelian inheritance, let's get into when Mendelian inheritance breaks down and doesn't work anymore. We're going to hit a couple of things. Incomplete dominance is seen in snapdragons. So snapdragons are a pretty flower. I'm not going to attempt to draw a snapdragon flower. Well, why not? Oh, that is awful. So, that is not what a snapdragon flower looks like, but that is a flower. Some snapdragon flowers are red. Some snapdragon flowers are white. If you combine a red snapdragon and a white snapdragon, under Mendelian inheritance, you would expect the offspring to be whichever color is dominant, right? So is the red dominant or is the white dominant? Well, the answer is neither is dominant. In fact, what you get is an offspring that is a blend of both phenotypes. So this offspring will be pink. So if we have our red allele and our white allele, I'm going to make that a W just because I don't want to slip into dominance recessive. So you'll have red and you'll have white snapdragons, and you get a pink snapdragon. This is incomplete dominance. So the expression of the genes is a mix or a blend of the two parental genes. So we don't get one being expressed over the other. We get a blending of expression. We can separate this from codominance. My next slide apparently doesn't have any animation, so it's all just on there. In codominance, all the alleles are fully expressed. All alleles fully expressed. So let's talk about how this is different from incomplete dominance, right? In a snapdragon, you had red times white, giving you pink. An incomplete so if that's incomplete dominance, a blend. Codominance is slightly different. If these snapdragons were codominant, you would expect the cells that produce the colors to express the red and the white. So you'd see a similar result. The flower would look pink, but if you zoomed in on those cells, some of those cells would be expressing red and white. So this hypothetical flower is a terrible example. So let's go into an actual example. And that would be horses. Come on. So in horses, we actually have codominance. And so if you look at a horse that's called a roan, oh yeah, look at that awesome horse. Oh, I think this is a pig. Give it a bushy horse tail. And now it has to be a pony. Anyway, a roan horse looks red a little bit. And with white patches. But when you look at that horse, it is codominance between alleles for red hair and alleles for white hair. And you'll have individual hairs being expressed as fully red or fully white. Or with red blood cells with blood typing, which you're doing in lab this week. Some of you already have done it. You have the ABO blood types, in which you have type A, in which you have type A, B, AB, and O. And these are little proteins on the red blood cell. These are little proteins. So say this is an A protein. And then maybe this is a B protein. Codominance in red blood cells means that if you have alleles for A, you express A. Remember, we've got to have two alleles. So you'd have an IA, IA. This would produce a blood type. And so our red blood cell would have A proteins all over it. If you have IB, this gives you a B blood type, in which you have little B proteins all over it. You could also have IA, IB, in which case your red blood cell has A and B proteins. Whoa. In other words, both the A allele and the B allele are being fully expressed. All alleles are fully expressed. The O actually codes for nothing. So if you had IA and the O allele, you'd still be type A because this is codominance. So one allele would be saying make A proteins. One allele would be saying, for my part, make no proteins. So you make A proteins. So IBI is type B, where you make B proteins. And then there's type O blood, where you have two O alleles, and you have your red blood cell, and there's none of these AB proteins on the surface. So, whoa. We're getting all over the place. That's good enough. All right, so let's take a look at the blood type, genotypes, and phenotypes. Type A, we could have IA. We could be homozygous for A. We could be heterozygous for A. We could be homozygous for B or heterozygous for B. We could be type AB, where we're heterozygous with an A and a B. When I say heterozygous for A, I am automatically implying that it's type A, and the only way you could be type A and heterozygous would be if you have the O allele. So if I say heterozygous type AB, I mean it's got an A and a B. Type O, you can only be homozygous. You can only be type O if you're homozygous for the O allele. Phenotypes. As I did in my drawing, we have type A, which could be either of these. Type B, which could be either of these. There's type B. Type AB, which you can only get from this specific combination. And type O, which you can only get from this specific combination. So if you're type A, if your phenotype is type A, you don't actually know your genotype. You could be homozygous for the A allele or heterozygous with the O. And same goes for if you're type B. The only time you actually know your genotype is if you're AB or O. This is a cool thing about the immune system. Your white blood cells, we talked about our macrophages a while back, how their whole job is to patrol around your body and recognize something that's non-self, like here's something non-self, and here's the macrophage, and it extends around in order to eat the non-self. It attacks and kills non-self. So, the immune system is a whole series of cells and chemicals that attack the non-self. They detect self versus non-self. The white blood cells actually bind to detect it. And red blood cell A and B proteins are one of the things they use to determine self or non-self. So once they bind to a cell, they determine if it's self or non-self, and then they attack the non-self. A and B proteins are these sort of identify friend or foe things going on. So if you have type A blood, right, I guess here it's using the triangles, your macrophage is going to say, oh, type A, that's self, leave it alone. And then if somebody gives you a transfusion and you get some type B blood in there, your macrophage rolls over here and goes, whoa, what is this? No, thank you, please. And it attacks the B blood cells. So that's why your type A, type B, A, B, and O are so important, which is pretty cool. Type O here, because it has no proteins on its surface, it cannot be detected by the immune system when it comes to AB blood types. So type O can be given to anyone. But your own immune system, if you're type O like me, will only recognize a red blood cell that has nothing on it. So if you get type A, type B, or type AB blood, that's non-self. So you can donate to anyone, but you can only get type O blood. Type B, they can donate to B, or they can also donate to AB, because type AB blood, this is nice, if you have type AB, you are what's called a universal acceptor. You can take blood from type B, because you have B proteins that are self. You can take blood from type A, because you have A proteins that are self, and you can always get type O blood. That's nice. But you can only donate to type AB. And then type A, you can donate to A or AB. So that's how blood transfusions work and the immune system. All right, continuing on. Pleiotropy is an interesting wrench in the gears. Basically, when you have pleiotropy, you have one gene that has an effect on a large number of different traits. This here is the frizzle chicken. The frizzle chicken has one gene, the frizzle gene. And if it has the frizzle gene, then it produces these curled feathers. But that's not all. You know, call now right away, and you can also, with that frizzle gene, in addition to curled feathers, have abnormal body temperatures, degrees Celsius. An increased metabolism compared to normal chickens. Increased blood flow, blood velocity compared to normal chickens. An increased digestive capacity, but decreased egg-laying rates. So, pleiotropy, you have one gene, the frizzle gene, that affects not only feathers, but body temperature, metabolism, blood flow, digestive capacity, and egg laying. So one gene affects many different phenotypes. Marfan syndrome is a human-based example of pleiotropy. So Marfan syndrome is based on a dominant gene. And if you have the dominant Marfan gene, you have long limbs, poor eyesight, a weakened aorta, right? If you have your heart, come back here, yeah. Right, if you have your heart here, there's the left and the right side, right? The aorta is this big blood vessel that first comes off when sending blood to the rest of the body. It has to be really tough because it experiences the greatest pressures in the body. So if you have Marfan syndrome, you have a weakened aorta, which can suck. And my favorite symptom or trait, other. Oop. So this is a person with Marfan syndrome, which is pretty cool. There's actually a really well-known actor who's basically made his life acting in horror movies. And he does a lot of characters that have spindly long arms that move in unreal ways. And he actually has Marfan syndrome. I should probably look that up and put it in here because that's cool. Anyway, polygenic inheritance could be considered the opposite of pleiotropy, right? In pleiotropy, you had one gene affecting many, whereas in polygenic inheritance, one gene or many genes, right? A large number of genes, or however many genes, more than one gene affects one phenotype. Many genes, one phenotype. The total expression of that phenotype is the sum of different dominant and recessive alleles. Skin color is the gold standard for polygenic inheritance. There are 3 separate genes that govern skin color. 3 genes. Remember, you have 2 alleles for every gene, so 6 alleles. And the combination of dominant and recessive alleles will determine skin color, where dominant alleles in skin color code for melanin production, and the recessive does not code for melanin production. So, the more melanin the more dominant melanin alleles you have, the darker the skin color. Pretty simple. So this is a nice little picture showing the different potential possibilities. You have over here the lightest skin color possible, where you're homozygous recessive for all 3 genes, right? Gene A, B, and C. You're homozygous recessive for all of them. That's the lightest you can get and not be an albino. And then down here is where you're homozygous dominant for all of them, and that's the darkest skin color can get. So, and basically skin color is just a beautiful range of different shades. This whole melanin thing is an adaptation to where you live and how much sunlight you get. So human ancestral populations, right? You had the globe, right? It's tilted on its axis. Here's the equator. And you have sunlight coming in. So sunlight comes in and it gets reflected. Some gets passed through, some gets reflected. More sunlight gets reflected at the poles due to the angle of the atmosphere. Whereas on the equator, you just get more sunlight reaching there. So you get more direct sunlight along the equator. Greater amounts of sunlight. At the poles, you get much less sunlight. Sunlight helps stimulate vitamin D production. At the same time, sunlight carries UV radiation that can damage your cells, can cause skin cancer. Melanin blocks UV radiation. So, the more melanin you have, the more you block the harmful effects of ultraviolet radiation. However, the more melanin you have, the less vitamin D production you get going, because you need sunlight to penetrate into the cell to get that vitamin D production. So these various beautiful shades all occur based on where you are on the planet. If you're further north or south, you're going to see lighter skin shades because you're going to have less sunlight, so you want a lot more sunlight to pass through to get vitamin D production. At the equator, where you get the most light, right here, you're going to get way more light than necessary for vitamin D production, and UV radiation becomes a much bigger concern. So you would naturally see greater amounts of melanin. So you just get more melanin to less melanin as you move away from the equator. Pretty darn cool. So multifactorial trait is really fascinating. This is when you have polygenes, remember, where you have more than one gene, like with skin color, affecting one single phenotype, and that the magnitude of that phenotype's expression is based on the alleles, the sum of the alleles. Well, in multifactorial traits, we have polygenes, but we have a really important thing, the environment. So in this case, the environment directly affects expression of that polygene, right? You might be saying, based on my talk about skin color and, your latitude on the earth, the environment, of course, affects it. But this is where the environment has a direct effect as you're growing up, right? I cannot, my skin color is about my skin color. I can burn, but I'm not going to be able to drastically change my skin color if I go to the equator. Whereas in a multifactorial trait, the environment can have a direct effect on that phenotype. Himalayan rabbits are our gold standard example. Himalayan rabbits are a pure white rabbit with dark points in its fur. So its ears, its nose, and its little feet. Those are the dark points, and of course, its poofy tail. Sure. So we're going to have dark points or dark extremities. And these extremities are dark because of the temperature of their environment. Right? What do you know about your extremities and temperature? Right? Especially in the mornings right now or at night. What gets cold when you go out there? You're right. It's your extremities. Your ears get cold. Your nose turns red as it gets really cold. Your fingers and your toes get cold, right? Well, looky there. That's what we see having the dark color of fur in these Himalayan rabbits. In fact, it's the low temperature that allows the expression of these polygenes, turning the fur into the skin dark and the fur dark. So here's some Himalayan rabbits. This is my favorite picture because it's so cute. And we can see that only the widowed noses and ears and feetsies and poofy little tails are dark. And this is all about heat loss and conservation of heat, right? Because we know that if you have a car with a black interior on a summer day and you forget to crack the windows, your car is basically a lava pit. Dark colors absorb heat, absorb and retain heat. So these Himalayan rabbits have these dark points to absorb and retain heat, to limit the loss of heat from their bodies due to cold. And it's precisely during development the cold that turns those extremities dark. Right? So this was an actual experiment researchers did, where they took a Himalayan rabbit and they shaved its back. So they took a razor and they shaved its back. Then they put an ice pack on and left the ice pack on while it regrew its hair. And when it regrew its fur, the new patch of fur was dark. So that means that it was the environment governing the expression of that polygene. And that's it, folks. We're done. Woo! This lecture is complete.